As a writer and a teacher, Tina's work explores class, generational hardship, and the social constructs that marginalize the poor. Her essay, The Life We Pay For, was the top 10 most read of 2019 Oregon Humanities Magazine feature. Her memoir, Rough House, is forthcoming from OSU at the end of this month / early October. And it was selected as an October Indie Next title, which the Indie Next title is a huge thing in the indie bookselling world. It's a top 10, or sorry, top 10 or top 20 books selected by independent booksellers. And it's booksellers across the nation that select that. So it's pretty exciting. On a personal note, I met Tina, I've been doing over 10 years or so, when she called Waucoma and introduced herself. Philip had asked her to run Clint's, and she called us to ask us how to run a bookstore. We weren't really sure what to do with the call, but we're like, okay. And we got to know Tina, and now she is my son's godmother. I'm so, so proud of Tina and everything she's accomplished. She's always been an excellent writer. She's always someone I can have edit my emails and articles for the bookstore. And Rough House is just, it's so, so, so good. It's my advanced reader of it. It's so good to the point that when I read this book, I can hear her in my head talking when I read it. It just flows, it's so accessible, and I read it in one sitting. And if you know me, you know that I have a 3-year-old, so I don't actually read a lot of books, like physical books anymore. I do a lot of audiobooks. I just think that Rough House is just the beginning for Tina, and I can't wait for what's in store for her in the future. I'm just so excited for her, not just as a bookseller, but as a friend and a writer. And I'm going to turn it over to Keenan.
All right, so thank you to Waucoma Bookstore, and I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation with Tina. I was Tina's MFA thesis advisor at Goddard College while Tina was working on the early drafts of Rough House, and so it's really great to see this project come to full fruition. So at this point, I guess we'll just get started with our Q&A. So Tina, once again, it was my pleasure, my honor to work as your thesis advisor on this project. The story is a deeply moving one, a family saga that I hope all the folks who are on this call will all purchase and read and be moved by just as I was. James Baldwin said of his first book, Go Tell It on the Mountain, that it was what he had to write if he was ever going to write anything else. Did you feel that way about Rough House? How long did do you think it took for, how long did you think about writing this book before you sat down and wrote it? There you go, there's the question.
Leave it to me to start talking while I'm muted. I was saying, wow, you're going to whip out James Baldwin right out of the gate. They're like he's amazing. I think that's absolutely true. I think I did have to write this before not before I could write anything else. I wrote some bad fiction before I wrote this book. I think I had to write it before. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. Yes. I think I had to write it before I was ever going to write anything really worth reading. Because I think that this book in many ways was like putting down a burden, kind of. And I think that and that burden was maybe just sort of like the need to pretend to be anything other than what I was. And I think before that I was writing, when I was finishing my bachelor's degree, my kids were 7 and 12-ish. And I remember I would take writing classes because I loved them. And I wrote a lot of bad fiction with protagonists who were kind of like my personality, only they had dads who paid for college and had season tickets to something. Not a dad like mine who would go find a piece of land and squat on it and live in a tent or live in a shack that he built, and who had his nose broken on a pool table in Wenatchee, and who would disappear for long periods of time, but who also, sort of magical to me. And so I would just I would write these stories that just, to me, felt like posing when I look back on that. And I think writing this book was a way to sort of let go of all of that. And even when I first started to write about my childhood or anything like that, I would try to do it like in the hybrid form or make it cool or hip in some way. And then finally I'm just like, Tina, you're not cool. Just write it the way that feels right. And I think there's something, I think before I could write it, you know, Sandra Cisneros has a really beautiful memoir called A House of My Own. And she talks about how the privacy for self-exploration is a privilege of the wealthy. And so I think too, also, as I became more educated and more financially secure, there was another sort of space created that allowed me to write. Because when you grow up poor, there's a lot of shame that you carry around that doesn't come from your family, it comes from the rest of the world. So as you gain financial security and education, that starts to sort of slough off, I think, at least for me. And so once that shame's gone, you really have the space to, I think, you know, interrogate all of that a little more. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, definitely it does. Thank you. You know, every book is a journey, and from the experiences that and the imagination that goes into creating it, to actually taking up the journey of the book, the challenge of the book, to seeing it through all of its different phases. So we're all really glad that you took on that challenge and that you've written this book. Please talk about the significance of how the book begins.
Okay. I just want to say first that you have a lot to do with that, Keenan, with this book coming to fruition, because I think you really gave me courage in a time when I didn't have it. And you're just very gifted at what you do, both as a writer and as a teacher. So the book begins with, there's a couple things that I think are important about the way the book begins. I think when you're writing memoir, sometimes people will say, oh, I heard you wrote a book. And I'll say, yeah, what's it about? And I'll say my dad, and they'll be like, I should write a book. And I'm always like, yes, you should. I would love to read your book. But I think people think when you write your life, it's not work, and it's so much work. Especially, I really wanted to write literary memoir. I wanted to write a memoir that read like a novel and used all the tools of fiction. So the book begins with this scene where my dad's teaching me to ride a bike. And I started the book the way it starts for a couple of reasons. Number one, it begins with the line, "You might not consider my dad a good man." And I think a big part of my sort of writing journey was interrogating who's a good person and who isn't, like thinking about that and challenging the notion of a good person. The idea of who is good and like who deserves our empathy. And as a society, I think we tend to reserve empathy. We tend to be like, well, I don't feel sorry for that person. They brought this on themselves or whatever. We kind of hold empathy back from people unless we find them deserving. And I think that's interesting because it's not like we have a quota on how much empathy we can extend toward people. It's not like it's a resource that will run out. So I was really curious about this kind of notion of a good person. And again, the more educated, the more financially secure I became, the more I came to think about like the shame I carried and where it came from. And that, yeah, my dad was not a perfect man. He did a lot of things that are very troubling, as you know. But that shame, when you're a child, you love your parents, and I didn't get the shame from them. I got it from the judgment I felt from the rest of the world. And so I think I came to realize would I be better off without him? No, I don't think that I would. And so I was just kind of thinking about how as a society, we've made it a habit to sort of insert ourselves in between poor parents and their children. And a couple ways we do that a lot are obviously through like the, children's services and through jail and prison. When my mom was pregnant with me, my dad went to jail for 6 months, and he did something wrong. He stole somebody's chainsaw. It's in the book, right? I get it. But if you sat down and crunched the numbers, like, would society be better served by sending him to jail for 6 months and leaving his pregnant wife, who also has a 2-year-old, without income because he was the breadwinner in the family, you know, and it just, it's just, so definitely I think that I started with that line, "You might not consider my dad a good man," because that was the question that I kind of wanted to explore the whole time. I love the essay form, and, you know, essay is all about wondering and never really coming up with an answer. At least my favorite essays are. And I just kind of wanted to wonder over this idea, because I certainly have noticed now that I'm in the middle class, that people here, when we make big mistakes, they don't become our whole identity. You know, it's like a blip in your radar. It's like, ooh, they had some misfortune, we're going to be quiet and give them privacy around that. But it doesn't become their whole identity. You know, they don't become known as the homeless guy, the addict, the this, the that, right? So I was just curious about all of that. And then as far as, like, I wanted to begin with the bike riding scene, because I think everyone can relate to learning to ride a bike. Most people can relate to that. So later in the book, when people cannot understand Lloyd as a character, I wanted to start them off with something that's like, here he is, he's being my dad, he's teaching me to ride a bike, but it's also kind of brutal. Everything with Lloyd, I wanted the first chapter to be a roadmap that tells the reader what to expect from the whole book. And the bike riding was just the perfect metaphor for that. Like, you know, he told me one day, you're not going inside, you're not getting a drink of water, you're not eating, you're not going to the bathroom until you ride the bike. And it didn't matter how bloody I was and how much I crashed, I just had to keep getting on the bike. And then, of course, in the end, I rode the bike, and all of a sudden this, you know, sky cleared and the angels sang, and I thought I had the coolest dad ever. And so I thought it was just a great, like, kind of less harmful way to show how every time I engaged with my dad, there would be pain and there would be a gift.
That's powerful. It's very powerful. Could you please read a section from the book?
Yes, let's see here. I thought if I was going to read tonight, Jenny, will you do me a favor? I'm sorry to interrupt, but my mom can't get in. I don't think she received the link. Can you resend it to her? I'll send you her name. Because, I mean, I got to interrupt for my mom, right?
That is totally appropriate.
Okay, so this is I thought I would read this little section tonight because, Keenan, this is a little piece that I wrote in a workshop you were teaching, and it was the first day that you became my advisor, and we had like a writing, you gave a prompt, and this is what came of it. So I thought it would be kind of fun to read that. Okay, so this is, let's see, what background do you guys need to know about this? This is just in a section of the book where where I'm talking about how my dad was a storyteller, and he used to tell a lot of stories, and he would turn almost all of his stories were about either me and my brother or himself, and usually logging stories. And my dad had this gift for sort of turning stories into like almost like a fable or a myth or like folklore. Like I just never got tired of hearing him tell stories. So so this is me kind of recounting my favorite one of his stories. And this is a day that he was out in the woods alone, and he claims that he popped his eye out while he was out there. So my favorite was the story about the day Lloyd popped his eye out. Lloyd is my dad, guys. My favorite is a story about the day Lloyd popped his eye out in the woods. He was packing out his saw at the end of the day when it happened. He was last man out, thinking about catching up to his buddies to grab a beer before heading home as he picked his path through the thick litter of the forest floor. I can see this scene. That was the trick of Lloyd's stories. He always set them up with a simple hook, something true and clear I automatically trusted. He knew his audience. We were timber children, so this story had a beginning so familiar we could picture it right off. We knew Lloyd packed his saw out on his left shoulder always. We knew the blade would lay flat and steady over the space between his neck and his shoulder and run out in front of him as if leading the way. The motor just behind him, cased in hard orange plastic, his left hand flung up over the blade, the crook of his elbow against the chain, keeping the saw steady for his hike out. I knew the way my dad packed his saw out of the woods, like I knew the sound of my own breath from inside my head. I could even smell Lloyd, sweat, sawdust, gasoline, and hear the snapping of his feet breaking 1,000 unknown things with each step. This image was truth. Lloyd said he was packing out his saw when he put his black steel-toed boot down, and it sank into forest flotsam and landed with full weight of man and saw on a branch fallen from above. It was a big one. If I'd have been standing there when it fell, it could have been a widowmaker. The branch was too strong to snap, so when Lloyd stepped on it, he created a fulcrum and seesawed it up into his own face like a bad cartoon, a farmer stepping on a rake as he chases a naughty rabbit caught eating his carrot patch. That branch couldn't have been a much better length to do him damage. He said it came right up and gouged his eye clean out. I shit you not. That sucker just poked right in there at the corner of my eye and pop. Before I knew it, my goddamn eye was hanging out in front of my face and I was in a world of hurt. I had so many questions here. Questions I never asked, because from earliest days, I understood my role in maintaining Lloyd's fictions. Daddy misses you. Daddy's sorry. Daddy wishes your mama would let him see you. Daddy's gonna come get you just as soon as he gets a car, a paycheck, a break from work. Still, I wanted to know so many things. I wondered if his eye could see anything as it lay there suspended by tendrils never meant to know open air. I wondered if that eye sent images to his brain of the leafy bracken below, or maybe his own cheek, lips, chin. I always at least half believed Lloyd, and if there was any chance his story was true, I wanted to know what the eye saw from its foreign angle, but I never asked. Too many details might expose the story as fiction, and I didn't want to let go of the possibility of truth. Lloyd stood there gauging his options. He was alone in the forest, chainsaw on his left shoulder, metal lunch pail in his right hand, thermos tucked into his right armpit, right eye dangling on the top of his cheekbone, and a couple of miles to go before he was literally out of the woods. Kids, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. He squatted down, dropped his lunch pail and thermos, set his still on the ground, and went about the awkward business of handling his loose eye with dirty, calloused hands. My dad had hands with their own incredible landscapes. There were soft sandy beaches and dry, scorched deserts on those hands. There were cracks so deep that black grease had seeped in to create permanent lines, marking out the boundaries between all the territories of his hands. And here he was, about to cup his exposed eyeball in a greasy, sweaty palm, about to use his rough fingers coated in sawdust, painted on with gasoline, oil, premix, to gingerly touch his vulnerable, precious eyeball. Well, kids, right then I figured, hell, can a man fall trees with only one eye? I wasn't sure. I just knew I couldn't fall trees if I died before getting out of them woods, so I had to do something, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna leave my saw behind. So I put this part of my palm, did I just read that? No, so I put this part of my palm, sorry. I put this part of my palm up under that eye and just shoved it back in. It hurt like a son of a bitch, but what else could I do? Lloyd didn't try to open the eye. He didn't even want to think what that might feel like, and he'd had enough trauma in the woods for one day. He hefted his saw back up on his shoulder, tucked his thermos back into his armpit, grabbed his lunch pail, and finished packing himself out with that eye shut the whole time. Man alive, my pickup sure was a sight for a sore eye. He threw his saw on the bed, set everything else on the bench seat, jumped in, and headed straight for the hospital. It was the only time in his life he took himself to a doctor without some woman hollering at him to do so. According to Lloyd, the doctor could see no course of action but to pop the eye back out. They needed to clean out the sawdust and whatnot Lloyd had gotten up in there. He had to hang his head over a stainless steel basin so his eye could float in some sort of saline mixture until the doctor was satisfied it was clean. Then that doctor popped Lloyd's eye back into the socket, good as new. Lloyd's eyes were beautiful, and I always loved looking in my daddy's hazel green eyes. Good or bad, his eyes told you exactly what he was thinking and where he was headed. I knew by looking at his eyes if I should run toward him or run away. Lloyd's eyes are my eyes, though I always thought they were more magic on his face than mine. After he told us that story, I was always lingering on the right eye, trying to find evidence to back his story, but it looked the same as it ever had.
Thank you so much. You know, I know in the Zoom format, you can't hear people laugh and see them smile, but I couldn't hear them laugh either because, you know, their mics are all on mute. Thank you for having your mics on mute. But I did scroll through and see them laughing. So that's part
Oh,
of that.
that's sweet, Keenan. Thank you.
But that is both a funny and a really beautifully written passage. Thank you for reading it. Lloyd himself is not a reader, but he likes to tell his children stories like the one, you know, that y'all just heard. What role, and I kind of think of these stories kind of like origin myths, you know, or his origins, family's origins. What role do these stories play in the narrator's understanding of her family as she grows older? Your family.
Well, that's a layered question. They're definitely a big part of the structure of Rough House. Like, it was important to me to include a lot of Lloyd's stories and his sort of myth making, because that did create my childhood. That you know, that was true to me as a child. But I think that you know, there are three things really that storytelling I think of as like having impacts, three major impacts. And one was that was self-confidence. Like, every time he told stories about my brother and I, the main theme was just how much he loved us and how everything we did was so great. And so he, like I've said before, my dad would hurt me 100 ways. And but first he definitely instilled this sense of self and this idea that, like, I deserve to take up space in the world, that you know, you could tell he just loved us so much. And he communicated that a lot in the way he would tell stories about us. And it's funny because, you know, both of my parents were storytellers, and I think of Lloyd's storytelling as almost his parenting. You know, neither of my parents were able to parent the way you or I will use that word now. As like, my parents wouldn't use parenting as a verb, right? And because they're just getting by from day to day, right? And the kids are just sort of running around in the background. But this was a way that he took time to connect with us and really, you know, try to sort of make a connection. But then as I was a little older, I definitely started to see Lloyd's storytelling also as almost a crude manipulation. And I don't think he even knew he was doing it, but, you know, he would retell stories even where there was a lot of violence in our household. And he would tell stories of things that were violent or uncomfortable, or, you know, maybe that I thought of as sad, and they were always funny. And I think that was his way of, I don't know if he was trying to make it better. I don't know if he was trying to revise my view of things, you know what I mean? Like, change the way I saw it. But as I grew older, I began to recognize it, that the way he told a story was often, the feel of it was very different than how I remembered experiencing that story. But then, like, as I got even older, I began to see storytelling and kind of Lloyd's way of storytelling almost like a moral imperative. Like, I'm feeling this need to carry that on. I mean, that's what this book is. This is me. Now I'm the storyteller. I remember when I had Banu as an advisor, and there was a point when I was writing to her and I was feeling kind of lost. Like I knew I was going to write this book. I knew it was going to be about my dad. And I had all these things flying all over the place, but I didn't have like my central purpose. I didn't have like the heart of it. And I remember saying to her, I was rereading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which, you know, you think of it as like being about this doctor and his hubris and all of this stuff. But I was looking at it and thinking of it like as parenting, like the doctor creates this creature and then abandons him. And then the monster only becomes monstrous because he approaches human beings and tries to connect with them. And they're so repulsed by him that they are violent toward him, or, you know, whatever. And so he becomes a monster in his isolation. And I was just kind of thinking about that in terms of Lloyd as I was writing. And I wrote to Banu and I said, you know, what does it mean when the monster is the maker? If you are made by somebody who can be so monstrous? And she wrote me back and said, well, in this work, you are Lloyd's maker.
That's true.
And that was a really big so I thought of that in terms of storytelling, and like, I want to be Lloyd's maker, but in a way that's really honest. So it's like, can I tell all these bad things he did, but still show you how wonderful and lovable he was, and how some people are born into circumstances that don't always, that turn them monstrous in some ways, you know?
Yeah. No, I think that's a, you know, deeply, like, that's a deep reflection, and I think that a lot of people can both relate to it and you know, will also, you know, be provoked to deeper thought by it. So as a child, you you had a hard time telling the difference between Alcoholics Anonymous and the Kingdom Hall. Why was that?
So, you know, my dad would kind of go through cycles. So you guys, a beautiful thing is that OSU Press made a really beautiful book trailer for Rough House. I'm sure Marty could probably put the link in the chat, but there's this is sort of explained well in there as well. That's what made me think of it, and lots of pictures of my dad and stuff. But so Lloyd kind of, my mom we left him when I was 5, and we left after a very violent episode. We sort of fled with very little notice, threw some things in the car. And after that, I think that his addictions came to rule more of his life. He kind of stopped working his paid job because he was, they attached his wages for child support, and he would move around kind of around his territory. And he had all these little small timber and mill towns where he would stop and live for a while and then move on. So he was kind of always cycling through this territory, and he was also would cycle through a system of sobriety and then falling off the wagon. And so whenever my dad was trying to be sober, he was going to the Kingdom Hall. His mom was a Jehovah's Witness, and that's the religion he associated with. So he would be going to the Kingdom Hall, and he would be going to AA. And like one year, my brother and I went back to live with him and went to school with him. And during that time, we were always going with him to the Kingdom Hall and to AA. And I just I got confused about the difference between these two things, because they are both called meetings. And and the buildings were similar, and like the people looked similar to me, but also I think in a deeper level, it was because they were both so deeply tied to his sobriety. So it just kind of all spilled into the same sort of image for me. And I think when I was a teenager, I was sort of harsh or judgmental towards specifically AA. It actually took me years to even realize that my dad was a Jehovah's Witness, because he always called it meetings. And like, I had friends at school when I'm with my mom who were Jehovah's Witnesses, and I didn't make that connection. I feel like so ignorant for that, but it's just true. Even though I went to so many meetings as a kid. But yeah, so I definitely as a teenager came to have sort of a judgy, sort of rebellious attitude toward AA, because I felt like maybe it was just like another addiction for him, but that was just like kind of my immature self being sort of, I think, rebellious. And I think as I've gotten older, the whole system of AA, I find it really kind of appealing and endearing. And a lot of the phrases are still very dear to me. Like I'll hear them and because I remember hearing my dad say them all the time, like let go and let God, or what's the one about one drink too many and one is never, there's one about how there's never enough. Someone's going to know it and can put it in the chat. But there were just a lot of very familiar sayings, and, you know, they're cliches, but cliches become cliches for a reason, because people connect to them. And I also think, you know, I don't know if you read Leslie Jameson's The Recovering. Oh my gosh, it's so good. It's a huge, huge memoir, but it's kind of a braided memoir, and it's got her memoir of recovery. And then she does a lot of research on literary giants who were addicts and used AA. So it's got like Raymond Carver and John Berryman and all these people. And then it's got this really amazing side-by-side comparison of the heroin addiction of Judy Garland and Billie Holiday. and how differently the exact same federal officer was chasing them. And like Judy Garland would be driven to a spa in a posh car, and Billie Holiday would wake up handcuffed to her hospital bed. I mean, this book's amazing, but I just loved everything. One is too many, three is never enough. Thank you, Ashley. You know, I think that book really also gave me a whole new view of AA, and now I don't know, I have a total fondness for it.
Yeah. So let me say to everybody who's all our audience members, at this point, we are going to open up the discussion to Q&A. So if you have questions for Tina about her book, please put them in the chat. I have one more quick question for you. And I'm actually going to go down to the second to last question here. But we do want to make sure we give the audience, 20 minutes to for questions, or 15 minutes or so for questions. So, I love the evocation of the natural world in this book, particularly the parts in Packwood. In fact, your book opened a new world to me, the world of loggers and timber children. I'm from urban and suburban California, where we don't think much about the wood that holds our houses together. As a Californian, when I think about disregarded migratory labor central to the American economy, I think about migrant workers in the San Joaquin Valley. I don't think about Paul Bunyan. I don't think about lumberjacks or white people living in labor camps. Do you think that stories like this one that you've told that present alternative narratives might be a bit of a bridge between sides in our hyper-polarized political discourse?
Oh, I love that. I love that idea. I mean, I would hope so. I think, again, this is another thing that I've sort of come to realize, I think, as I have become more educated and financially secure, is that, there's a historical, like, there is a history in this country of people who have all the power and all the money pitting the middle class against the poor and the poor against the poor. And so I get where your question is coming from. I would hope so. It's interesting because, I mean, I think it sort of had the power to bring you and I together. And it was so interesting because I remember you talking about your mom working in the fields. Was she working in the San Joaquin Valley? Was that where she did that labor?
Pretty much. I mean, her whole family. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. And it's funny because, I've talked to, in another interview the other day, somehow it came up that, that one thing that's been surprising to me about being middle class is that I sometimes get lonely. Like, there's a way that we all lived so close to one another and we're up in each other's business so much that I sometimes kind of miss, because my family now, we have privacy, we have space. And I love that. Don't get me wrong. My husband will tell you that, like, he'll walk in the room and I'll go to another room, but there is something about it that you miss. And I think that, I don't know, I think that sometimes there's a way that it can be harder to connect than what it was like for me growing up. And so I sometimes wonder if, like, I don't know, I guess anyone who's traded their labor for food and shelter, who's actually trading hours or labor, knows the feeling that is so deeply a part of this society, which is that you have to always strive to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, to kind of get to the next level, to be financially secure, and to make it into the middle class. And there's something about that process that expects a certain level of assimilation. Like, you leave people behind. There are people on this Zoom. I have aunts here right now who I haven't seen since I was a child. Because I thought part of doing the work of, like, getting into the middle class and being on my own 2 feet and pulling myself up by my bootstraps was leaving people behind. And, speech was a big thing, changing the way we talked in order to sound educated. And I think that, what I've come to lately is this idea that, like, why don't we get to keep the good parts. We should keep them. We should celebrate them. And I think if we all did that and told these stories, I think all of us would realize we have a lot more in common.
I think that is really well said, and I agree. I definitely agree. Thank you for that answer. Again, that really deeply thought out answer. So at this point, I guess there is something of a issue with the chat, and so chat questions from everybody on the call should go to Marty and Jenny. Do we have some questions that have come in?
Yes, we have actually a number of questions.
Okay.
So the first one, Tina, is from Lydia. In writing a memoir, a truth about a loved one, how do you or did you navigate other loved ones who share or are part of the story and may not be comfortable to be ready to tell truths or publicize these truths?
I think it's different for everyone. I did an event with another author last week who did not allow her family to read her book before she published it. And that was just how she needed to do it. That was what worked for her. For me, that didn't feel comfortable. And I think mostly because, you know, my mom and my brother in particular were also victims. You know, the book tells stories in which they are victims. And so it would have never felt right to me to not let them read the whole book before it was published. I also tried to find my stepmother, Linda, who's a really big character in the book, and unfortunately learned that she had passed away. But my mom and my brother read it and gave me feedback, and they both, even in scenes that I remembered things a little different than they did, they were both very, just kind of immediately like this, they were moved, but they also, like, I felt like they were grateful. Like, it felt like we got to go back to that time together, and in a safe way, in a way that we could enjoy the good parts. And, you know, so, I mean, did I answer your question, Jenny? I keep going off on tangents.
Well, I'll move on to the next
Lydia,
one.
Yeah, for me, Lydia, the answer is I let them read it. I always say to my students, I'm not a very good writer, but I'm a really good reviser. And so if they read it and discovered something that needed revision, I'm not afraid of that.
So Mary Peters is wondering, what period does your book take place? The 1980s? Were the timber wars with the spotted owls an environmentalist part of Lloyd's raising your family, for instance, like added stress or not able to work?
I don't remember my dad ever mentioning the spotted owl. It's so funny because an early reader was like, you got to put stuff in here about the spotted owl. And I absolutely remember the spotted owl, Mary, because I was a kid in the Northwest during that time. And especially in the towns where Lloyd lived, there were always those bumper stickers that were like, I love spotted owl fried or whatever. You know what I mean? Do you remember those? But I don't remember my dad ever talking about it. But I do remember what a big deal it was. And I remember, for me, I thought the spotted owl was cute. Like I was like a teenager when that was happening. And so I was just like, oh, save it, it's adorable. Like, you know, I didn't think of it in terms of like socioeconomic battle with the loggers. By then, my dad wasn't really legitimately logging anymore anyway. He would work under the table to kind of make ends meet. He usually lived in, you know, he didn't have really expenses. He would live in these kind of homesteads he would build, usually squatting on like Forest Service land, or he might use land that somebody would let him squat on in exchange for some chores. So he wasn't really in the industry anymore at that time.
Okay, so from Heidi, we have, what advice would you give your young self at whichever age you wish to speak to? It could be good advice for others who find themselves in the same situation.
I don't think I would give myself any advice. I think that's sort of what I came to in the process, right? Like any change in the story and I wouldn't be the same person. So I don't really know how to be anyone other than this person. So I don't know that I would change anything. I don't know that I would give myself advice. I don't know that I would give myself any advice.
Okay.
Good question.
This is similar question. did Tina have any hesitation writing about certain events because of possible negative reaction her family may have? How did she handle that conflict, doubt, if there was any?
Yeah, so I definitely, like I said, I had my mom and my brother read it. I do, I'm being protective of my family right now. I don't want to expose anybody who doesn't want to be exposed, but there is I do have one aunt who I wish would have had the opportunity to read it before and didn't. So I'm very excited for her to read it and to hear her reaction. But I tried to just, with respect, just offer it up to everybody to read so that there wouldn't be any of that.
Trying to keep up with the questions. Okay. At what point in your childhood did you start to question and wonder if the circumstances were different than what society projects as acceptable?
Good question. So my childhood actually shattered when I was 5, because that was when we had left Lloyd several times before then because of violence. But when I was 5, we kind of left him for good. And at that point, I had 2 different childhoods. My mom stayed in one place, and it was kind of Lloyd. I grew up in the Dalles. Anyone here who knows the Dalles, Oregon, knows it is not a big town, but my dad called it the big city. So he'd be like, well, your mom's raising you over there in the big city. And so from that point forward, I would say, I definitely started to, you can't help but see the differences between the way 2 parents are raising you, so you start to notice. And I feel like my mom, as soon as we drove away, it feels like she started like correcting our speech. And I think that was just her. She was, she understood her role in helping us get out of poverty. And I think she understood the way that language can be used as like a barrier. And so I remember her, starting almost immediately after we left him to say things like, well, ain't is not a word, honey. Or my brother and I would say, Jesse and me, Jesse and me. And she was always like, Jesse and I. And, she understood she was trying to help us assimilate, like we said earlier, into, a different kind of society, I guess. And it was interesting because from that point forward, whenever I would go back to my dad, I would change my speech because I understood, it's a respect thing. That it made him feel. I remember him telling me once, honey, daddy's just not book smart like you are. And I didn't want to make him feel like I was getting too big for my upbringing or whatever. So I would just kind of naturally change my speech back to the way that he spoke. I see that my niece Ashley says she still corrects us sometimes because she says my mom still corrects her speech.
Okay, so there's a couple questions related. Someone asked if your dad was still alive, but another person asked, how old were you when your dad passed away?
Yeah, sorry, you guys. I should have given you a synopsis of the book. So when I was 25 or 26 when he died, he was 48. So when I was 16 or 17, Lloyd and I kind of had a falling out, and we kind of had a tender sort of, we had made up and we're kind of trying to figure out how to really have a relationship. And we never really got all the way through that before he died unexpectedly when he was 48. It was really, really hard. And I had a baby and a young child. My brother had a baby, and, we just had to kind of stop our lives and go. I thought there was all this time and this potential, and it was just gone. So, yeah, I think I was 25, 26.
How long did it take you to write this? Because I'm writing a memoir and I really need to put it down for months at a time. Do you have something that you had to do during the writing process that helped you through painful stuff? And then the second part, I would say, combined with this, Tina, one of your natural gifts is making others feel comfortable and generally focusing on your attention on their experience, and almost never yours. As a deeply private person, are you surprised that you ended up writing a memoir?
Who asked that?
Avi asked the second part. The first part was from Carmen.
Abby, that's a good question. Okay, can you read Carmen's again, and then let's take them one at a time.
Okay. How long did it take you to write this?
That's an easy one. My whole life. And I mean, I finally have, and I finally had the courage to do something with it. Almost 98% Keenan was that. Like for me, once Keenan read it and felt like it resonated and encouraged that, I felt like, all right, maybe I should do something with this. And then later Curtis, Curtis Lowe, my friend who is on the, hopefully, I think maybe he was going to be on this call tonight, gave me a lot of encouragement as well. But my whole life, like I started, some of these stories started coming out, you know, at least probably 15 years ago. So it was a long slog. And I think you got to give it the time it takes. But hey, I teach creative nonfiction at CGCC, so you could sign up for a class there and we could talk about that more.
And what about the parts that were maybe painful or harder for you to write about? Did that take you longer?
Yeah, was that Abby's question? Yeah. So I thought Abby's question was really beautiful. I could tell it was somebody who knew me well. So it's funny. I think that the non-painful parts took me longer. I think that especially because it was a really big deal to me to create empathy for Lloyd and make people, like, if you just had a list of some of the things my dad did, you would be like, oh my gosh, he's the worst, but he was wonderful. And I wanted the book to show that he was wonderful. And so what I had to do is like show everyday moments where nothing that exciting happened. That's where you build those, that's what the years are made out of, not the moments of drama where his anger got out of control, but those moments where he was showing me seashells on the beach, or, you know, teaching me to whittle, or teaching me to ride a bike, or whatever, like those moments that are kind of boring, but that's where the tools of fiction really come into play. You have to build those scenes so slowly. And it's so funny how, you know, they say if you build it, it will come, from whatever movie that is. But I find that with writing, like if I'm trying to write a moment like that, I'll write it and walk away from it. And then like I'll be out jogging and something will emerge. Like I'll remember something else, some little detail about that moment, or, you know, so I sit there and just kind of build it out from there. So those parts take longer. The kind of boring, mundane moments took me a lot longer. The dramatic parts are so seared in your head. Usually you remember like every second of something like that. So it just comes out.
Okay. Did you have any unexpected realizations about yourself as you're writing the book?
Oh gosh. I think so. I think a lot of them. I think I realized I was a lot more like my dad than I had thought. Definitely, I thought if I was going to write memoir, I had to look at the parts where I was the bad guy. And that's hard to do in this book. Like my next book is a little easier because it's a lot more teenage and young adult years. But this book was like, I was a little kid. And so you can't make a child complicit in their own abuse, right? The adults are expected to be the adults. But I think I did realize sometimes that I was prone to the same sort of anger that my dad had. And that, you know, that was something I needed to pay attention to, and be aware of. And that was a big realization. When I was a little kid, after we left him, I immediately became a fit thrower, and I would throw these raging fits on my mom that I would have never done when we were still with my dad, because I would have gotten the smackdown. And like I would just feel the anger. I describe it in the book, like I would feel it start in my feet and work its way up my body. And there's a scene in the book where my mom starts carrying a wooden spoon in her purse, and like it would whip out and she would like spank me with it so fast. And there are probably people here who know that. And like Sherry, if you're here, you remember the wooden spoon. And it would like stop the anger immediately. But I think that was a surprising thing for me to come to as I was writing the book. I realized that I was, you know, I understood the impulse, the anger that he had.
Okay. You said something once about how frustrating it is to watch traits and actions that poor people have to incorporate into our lives for survival and hide, later becoming trendy for the wealthy. Can you speak to that a bit?
Who asked that?
It's Lydia. Come on, you know it's Lydia.
So I think maybe what she's talking about is, I remember this time, and I don't know if Curtis is on this call, but I remember this time I was invited to a dinner for a publishing a publishing house. And sometimes publishers will have authors with books coming out. Someday this will be us, Keenan. And like your publisher hosts a dinner where at a cool restaurant where they'll invite all these booksellers to come to dinner and have a dinner with the author. And it's just all about creating these relationships with people who might sell your book. And Curtis had invited me to this dinner with this author because he knew I had read early copies of this book and my daughter loved this book. It was a middle grade book. They were great books. Anyway, but he took us to this restaurant in Portland called the Huntsman's Tavern, I think is what it was called.
Yeah.
And we did it there, and Curtis had a table set aside and everything, but like you immediately know this is a place where there's like people stacked up outside trying to get in, and somebody in our party claims that they saw Fred Armisen and Carrie, the people from Portlandia, there. I can't say that I saw them there, but people said that. But yeah, so we're at this dinner and I'm so grateful to be invited. It was so wonderful. It was such a great time. But like we get there and they're definitely doing this kind of lumber sexual vibe where the guys are all kind of bearded and trying to look sort of like timber workers, but everything's very clean and pressed and the jeans are perfect. And they're wearing steel-toed boots, and all the women who are actually doing all the work, right? Who are actually schlepping all the trays and stuff are just in black leggings and clogs, so they like disappear into the background. But the men working there all have this sort of lumber look going on. And then for dinner, they bring us out these plates of trout that looks like it's been cooked over a fire, like it's got a stick still through it, like it's been turned over a fire. And I couldn't help it. I was just laughing because I thought, like, this is something my dad would have fed us when we were homeless. You know what I mean? Like, he would have caught this and grilled it over an actual campfire. And these guys are selling it for like $35, and that's just for the trout. You don't get any sides with that. And so I think that's probably what Lydia's talking about, that every now and again, I'll encounter something that's like super, like, it's funny. Rich people seem like they get rich and then they just want to be poor. Like they just like eat stuff that like, you know, like quinoa, like we're all stealing quinoa from people that actually need it. You know what I mean? So I think that's what she's talking about, is sometimes I just notice things that I'm just like, really?
I'm laughing because I was at that publisher
Oh,
dinner.
that's right, you were.
And I grew up in Portland, and so it's just very like this trendy area where it was, I always want to go to that place before, at least when I was growing up there. That restaurant's not in business anymore, which is very interesting. So let's see. Ooh, there's some good questions here. I'm gonna throw this in. Did you ever experience imposter syndrome while writing this book? Do you want to know who this is from?
I can't hear what you're saying. You have to say it.
Okay. Did you ever experience imposter syndrome when writing this book?
Oh my God. I'm experiencing it right now. Who was that? Oh, I see my daughter. Hi, honey.
That was your son. Your son asked
that was
that
my
one.
son? I don't see him. I'm totally scrolling to see everyone now. Absolutely. I all the time right now. I think that I just have to push through that. Like if I don't do it, nobody's going to ever hear the story. And, you know, I was very inspired to write this because my sister has had a lot of struggles in the last few years and things have not gone well for her. And I noticed the way my teenage niece was starting to carry that shame. My sister very much was plummeted into poverty and has had to rely on, I mean, things have never been really great for her, but it's been a really, really hard, like 6 years. And she had this experience, and I'll only share this story because I had her permission to share this story, where she was in the grocery store using food stamps and she was shamed for it. And after that, I sat down and wrote her a story about when she was little and she was really good at rollerblading, and how she used to move through space with like just such grace and power. And she was like really good at rollerblading when teenagers wanted to be good at rollerblading, but she was a little kid. So she was just kind of this badass in our neighborhood. And I wrote her the story just because she was just so depressed, and this thing had just happened to her in the grocery store. And she took it and said, she immediately read it to her teenage daughter. She was like, "Can I read this to Emma?" And so she read it to her daughter, and like she was crying, and then she asked me to read it out loud to her, and then she asked me if I could try to put it in the world where more people could see it. And so that story later became the essay that Jenny mentioned earlier from Oregon Humanities. And that definitely, seeing the way that gave my niece like this pride in her mom was definitely a big part of what pushed me to publish the book, which I originally wrote just because I wanted to teach at community college where I went, and I wanted to be a different kind of gatekeeper than some of the gatekeepers I had experienced when I struggled to go to college. And I couldn't afford to give up my job and go, even a couple times a week to Portland to get a regular master's. So I was like, well, maybe I could get into an MFA and do it low residency. And then it was like, oh, well, you have to write a book. Did I answer your question, Jenny?
I think so. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through trying to get all the questions. Roughhouse is a beauty, and writing about betrayal and gifts both is something that is hard and a real accomplishment. So how to be real within the memories and within the self is a discovery. What have you discovered about yourself in Roughhouse that surprises you now?
I think I sort of answered that earlier. I think the thing that I really discovered was that, was that from B. Gates? That sounds like a B. Gates question. Okay.
Yes.
Hi, B. B did a lot of work on this book with me. This book owes a big debt to B. Gates. I think that definitely discovering that I was more like Lloyd than I thought was probably the biggest discovery.
Too many things at once. Okay, writing equals healing. Agree or don't agree?
I agree, but I don't think you should. I think if you're writing to heal, you shouldn't be planning to publish it. That's my opinion, but I'm just one person. I definitely think writing is healing. I think it's great to write to heal, but I could never make a piece of personal writing into what I would consider a piece of art unless I had enough distance from it that the healing was already done.
Okay. Now that you've managed to tell your own hard story, how do you know when it's time for one of your students to begin writing the hard things from their own experience?
Is that one of my students?
That was Kim. Sorry.
I mean, when it comes to my students, I always tell them, I bet you I could ask one of my students to come on screen right now and they would tell you what I always tell them. But I don't want to embarrass you. I saw you, Kendra, and I saw you, Alexis, but I won't embarrass you. I always tell them if they think they're trying to write a memoir. People think they want to write a memoir because something crazy happened in their life. And Lee could probably answer this question too because she's taken that class. I always tell them, go home tonight and write the worst thing. And if you can do that without falling apart, then you might be ready to write that story. And it's funny because students, you won't be surprised to hear there's a chapter in the middle of my book called The Worst Thing. And that's where I got that. That's where I got what I always say to you guys. Go home and write the worst thing. And if you can do that and you're not falling apart, then it might be time to write that book.
So we have a couple more questions. I know we're a few minutes over 8 o'clock. Did you experience any anger at that publishing dinner or in other similar instances?
No, it takes more than that to make me angry. It didn't make me angry. It's just an observation. And I felt like I was being a little bit judgy and so I'm ashamed of myself for that. I should have more grace.
Tina, are you working on another book? And if so, what is it about, or would you like to write? What would you like to write about?
So I have a couple that I'm working on. I'm working on an essay collection, but I'm also, did my mom make it in? I'm also working on a book about growing up in the Dalles, and that was a different sort of poverty. Like with Lloyd, it was a very rural, very living close to the bone, close to the earth kind of living. Like we literally often lived in shacks he built, or we lived in a tent one year. But it was very elaborate. He built like a cool kitchen and stuff. But with my mom, we were always living, like we're kind of always at the mercy of a landlord. usually somebody who we kind of had a personal relationship with and would give us a cut on rent, but there were costs to that were, you know, she experienced poverty as a single woman that was very different than what Lloyd went through. My mom always was working 2 jobs, and we were kind of running around town feral, and it was a very different experience, and I still want to write that book. So I've got 2 projects I'm working on right now.
Okay, I think I covered all the questions. So my final question for both you and Keenan is, what books are you guys currently reading right now?
I forgot I was gonna show you the books I'm currently reading, and I forgot to bring it outside. Keenan, you go first.
Sure. Yeah, I am actually rereading Dust on the Tracks, or Dust Tracks on a Rose, or Zora Neale Hurston's autobiography. That's what I'm reading.
So I just started an audio of her. They just released The Crooked Stick? Did you see that? It's also Zora Neale Hurston. I'll find the title and send it to you. Super good audiobook. Let's see. There's a book that I just started that I left in the house, and I cannot remember the title, and I was going to show it to you. Jenny, it's not out yet. We have arcs of it. I think the author is Michelle Harper. Yes, it's called The Beauty in Breaking. And she is a Black woman, went to medical school, became a doctor. While when she finished medical school, her husband asked for a divorce. And so she kind of gets in this place where she's off to do her first residency. And at the same time, she goes through this painful divorce. And it's just about her experiences of empathy, giving empathy to people. She's an emergency room doctor. And I don't know, I've just started it, but it's really good so far. I really like it. And then I'm going to plug this book by Keenan called By the Lemon Tree, which I can't say I'm reading it because I read it a long time ago, but it's a very good collection of short stories that you guys should get your hands on.
Kelsey has a question for both of you. Why did you choose these books?
Well, I can say just quickly about Hurston. You know, I teach too, and I am considering teaching it in a class next semester. So that's why I have to reread it.
We're almost always teaching something or reading something because we're considering teaching it. I don't know, Chelsea. Why do you have to be hard? No. I think because truly, I just started that book a couple of days ago. I'm trying to read a lot, only read nonfiction as much as possible. And so it's just a book that I just started. It's called The Beauty in Breaking.
Thank you, you guys.
Thank you, Jenny.
So this wraps this up. There should have been, well, it probably already sent because we're at 8:09. There's an email that has a link to where you can purchase Tina's book. There's a quick survey. We would love it if you fill that out. That gives us some feedback on how we should do events better. This was our first virtual event for Waucoma and hoping to do more. And then also there are links in that email also to articles that Tina and Keenan referenced and during this talk, also links to their websites. And I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer any other questions that you might have for them. If you email them, their email addresses are on their website. And then also just wanted to mention their, this is my PSA from your friendly neighborhood bookseller that you should order your books early. There was a delay at the printer for Tina's book, so we expect that book to come in the first week of October. And once she signs those, we'll be calling people to pick up books, and then we'll also be shipping those books out. But your friendly PSA is they expect a lot of shortages with the supply chain for books. So October is the new December, and you should order your books early and shop early this year for the holiday season. Tina's book is also in the holiday catalog. So if you guys are familiar with our bookstore, we have a holiday catalog that comes out every year that we use, and Tina's one of the big featured books in there. So I'm pretty excited about that. It was so glad to see everybody in person. and see people's faces that I haven't seen in a long time. I don't know, Tina, do you or Keenan have anything else to say before we wrap up?
I just want to thank Keenan for his time, for being here, for all the support and encouragement. I hope I get the chance to repay it. I want to tell Keenan's mom she raised a fine, wonderful son who inspires people every day. And I want to say hi to B Gates because I know she finally made it in, and I'm just so grateful. B worked on this book with me a lot. B's an amazing poet. Look her up. Can we put here? I'll type it in the chat. And to all my family that's here, I have aunts that I haven't seen since I was a child. My niece Ashley, who I haven't seen since she was so little. So love you guys.
All right.
And her Goddard people.
This was recorded, so we'll also, if anybody missed this, there will be a recording on the Waucoma. I'll post it on our Waucoma website, and I will also send out a link to the Eventbrite list for everyone that was signed up. And then, Tina, do you have any other events that people would like to re-attend or support you in other ways?
I have an event a week through November. They're all on my website. Keenan is doing one more with me because he's an angel. That's next week at Rediscovered Books in Boise, Idaho. But they're all virtual, so geography is no longer an issue. So yes, I have at least one a week for the next couple months.
Well, great. Well, thanks for coming, you guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jenny.
You're welcome.
Good night. Night, Lillian. Oh, I see Alexis. Hi, Barb. I see you. Hi, Chels. Hi, Tappers. Hi, Susie. Hi, Lee.
It's like one big reunion of friends we haven't seen.
Hi, Lydia. Oh my gosh. The familia. Hi, Kelly. Hi, Carrie. It's good to see you guys. Hi, Dee. Ashley, you're so beautiful. I haven't seen you since you were little. Thank you, Marty, for humoring.
Oh, yes. So,
saying hi to everyone.
Thanks so much to OSU Press for helping us host this. I really appreciate it, Marty.
Thank you, Marty. You guys, this was amazing. We got like 80 people here.
Sorry for all the technical things happening in the background, but you guys are great.
You handled it with aplomb.
All right. Shall I end things now? I always hate to say goodbye.
Good night, you guys. Hi, Aunt Charlotte. Hi, Inez. Hi, Kimmy. Hi, Nicole. Good night, you guys. Good night, Lillian. Hi, Kim. Sorry, I'm just saying hi to everyone because I'm so happy to see you. Thank you, Keenan. So much appreciated.
Really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to Rediscovered, in 6 days.
Hi, you guys.
All right.